this morning for Assessing Your College's Readiness to Use New Advising Technologies webinar. Today we are going to be joined by Dr. Melinda Karp, Assistant Director with the Community College Research Center, and she will go ahead and describe what effective use of advising technologies looks like, share a framework for assessing your college's readiness to leverage advising technologies, and provide concrete suggestions for changing advising structures, processes, and norms. If you have questions during the presentation, please place them into the chat window located in the bottom left hand of your screen. David Quintanilla, our Training Support Manager, will be monitoring the chat and will be placing your questions into a queue that will be answered during our Q&A session. Our guest today, Dr. Karp, has led studies on advising, counseling, and support services with the CCRC for over 15 years. She has authored several publications in journals such as Teachers College Record, Community College Review, and the Journal of College Students Retention. She holds a BS in Human Development from Cornell University, an MA in Sociology and Education from Teachers College, Columbia University, and a PhD in Sociology and Education from Columbia University as well. Dr. Karp, thank you for being here today and welcome.
Wonderful. I'm so sorry. You know, I have a running joke that I'm the Luddite who runs the tech project, so this is just your evidence of that fact. I am, despite the delay, very glad to be here today. My name is Melinda Karp, and I am with the Community College Research Center, and I run a number of projects looking at student support, the largest of which is a long-term study examining how colleges use advising technologies. And so I'm so thrilled to talk to you all today as you start to think about the launch of new technologies statewide in California. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how I know what I think I know, and what we think it means to effectively use advising technologies. We have a very pretty clear definition of what we think effective looks like that's rooted in the experiences of colleges around the country, and I want to share that with you. And then I want to share some findings about how colleges have become successful in doing this work, again based on the research study that we're just finishing. And finally talk about two ways to think about your own work on your campus. One thing that often happens when we talk about these interventions is a look of almost deer in the headlights of, well, how do I do this because this is really big? And I want to share two potential strategies that you can bring back to your colleagues to start thinking about how to ensure that as these various electronic advising tools go live, you can use them successfully and in a way that really transforms the student experience, because that's kind of what it's all about, is making sure that these new tools help students have a better experience so that they can be more successful. Before I do that, I just want to introduce CCRC. I never like to assume people have heard of us. For those of you who don't know, we're located at Teachers College in New York City, and it is actually our 20th birthday. We were founded in 1996, and for 20 years we've been studying community colleges, all sorts of studies, quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, looking at a wide array of issues faced by community colleges. And our fundamental orientation is that we believe in the mission of open access to your institutions. We believe in the multiple missions. And like many people who love something or someone, we want to see them do better. We want to improve community colleges to improve the outcomes for students because we believe colleges, community colleges in particular, are a critical piece of our higher education system. And as Robin noted, my portfolio really focuses on student success and student support, so the outside of the classroom piece of the puzzle. So just to set the stage a little bit, when I talk about technology-mediated advising, or IPAS, or the ETI initiative, really what I'm talking about are a suite of tools, and I'm pretty technology agnostic. Again, I'm the Luddite. I don't really care which product we're talking about. What I care is what that product purports to do. So there are basically three pieces right now of technology that engage in student support or advising. Some products do degree planning, so those are the products that help you figure out, okay, I'm going to take all of these courses for the long term, not just this semester, but over the course of my career, that are going to get me to a degree. The hope, of course, being that if students can be more strategic, they won't fall off path and wander and earn lots of credits that don't get them a credential. They're approaching advising technologies that help students connect to other pieces of the support network. So whether that's case notes that faculty and advisors can share information on students or other ways of connecting students to services. And finally, there are early alerts and risk targeting. And that's when you raise a flag or you use an algorithm to identify students who may be at risk so that you can intervene in a timely fashion. We don't want to wait until a student fails a course. We want to be able to figure out who may be at risk of failing so that we can help them before it becomes too late. Ideally, a single suite would do all of these things. The reality is that right now, most of these functionalities come from different products. And so one technology challenge, of course, is knitting together those. And in California, it's really exciting because that's what you're trying to do. But many people and many institutions have to sort of pick from these different functionalities. But these are the three broad categories of technologies that I can think about when we think about technology-mediated advising. It is known, as I noted, by many names. I'm going to sort of flip because I think the space is pretty new and people use lots of different terms to mean the same thing. I call it technology-mediated advising because that's kind of the clearest. It's advising that's supported or mediated by technology. It's also a mouthful, so sometimes we call it e-advising. Often you will hear it termed IPAS, which is a term that's been sort of spread by the Gates Foundation and Achieving the Dream and others. It stands for Integrated Planning and Advising for Student Support. It's the same thing. It's just another term. And then there are the state and institution-specific titles. In Virginia, there's the Virginia Wizard. Obviously, there's the Education Planning Initiative in California. So there are lots of terms, but basically what they mean is when there's a technology architecture to support advising and student success. It's important to note that this is an effort, obviously, in California. It's going to scale, but it is happening around the country. And so one of the exciting things I think for you all is that there are lessons you can learn from some other places around what works and what doesn't. The Guided Pathways movement, which some of you may be familiar with, which is basically a whole school reform approach aimed at simplifying students' paths, really relies on a technology-mediated advising because what happens is if you start to streamline student paths, you can start to figure out who's not on that path and intervene. So through schools that are moving towards a Guided Pathways approach, we're seeing increased emphasis on advising, and particularly the use of technology to streamline and improve that advising. And then there's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's IPAS grant program, which has funded institutions to think about how best to leverage technology to support students. And I'll talk a little bit more about that because that's where our data come from. But I think it's important to note that these are pretty big. And so the result is that many places are doing this work. Many schools are doing it outside of these two initiatives, but there is sort of an architecture or network of institutions that are really thinking about the use of technology in the advising and student support space, and it might be useful to tap into those once you start to do your own work. This is actually a map of institutions that are involved not only in doing Guided Pathways or advising reform, but those two specific grant-funded initiatives that I talked about. And so you can see that it's national, it's around the country. We just tallied up the number of institutions and states that are trying to scale these approaches and came up to a number of about 300 colleges around the country, some clustered in specific state systems. But the point is there are a lot of people thinking about how do we use technology to support our students, really because the understanding is that in the past we've been resource constrained and we've got ratios, as I don't have to tell you all, of hundreds and hundreds of students to a single advisor, and that's not scalable, it's not sustainable, and it's not good for students, and frankly it's not fun to engage with student support in that kind of a way. So many colleges and state systems are thinking about how do you take technology and not replace people, but help people do their jobs better given the resource constraints that they're facing. So we have been engaged particularly with the IPAS work coming out of the Gates Foundation, but also in colleges that are doing this kind of reform outside of what I sometimes call Gatesland. But for the IPAS project, I'll talk about it quickly because, again, that's where our data come from, so it's useful to know. It's really an initiative to give not a ton of financial support, but a little bit to colleges that want to rethink advising and student support. There was an initial cohort of 19 schools. There's a new cohort of 26, and all of them are being funded to launch a technology tool in the advising space and then think about how to redesign advising to best use that tool. We've been a thought partner from the beginning. We've done some foundational research, and I'll share some of that with you, and have done what we call knowledge development, which is really CCRC's sweet spot. We do formal evaluations, but we tend to do research that leads to more questions. So starting to think about, okay, what's a question the field has? How can we give some answers? How can we use those answers to improve the field and provide strategic assistance, which inevitably leads to more questions. So for particularly the first round of grants, when this was still a very new concept and it wasn't even clear that colleges could launch this technology, let alone redesign advising, we were that research knowledge development partner where we thought deeply about what implementation looks like. Not does it work, but how do you even get to a place where you could evaluate it? And our key takeaway, which is what I'm really going to dig into today, is that this iPath work, this advising redesign, is an example of transformation in its best instantiation. That when you think about advising and using technology, what you're doing is you're giving yourself an entree to think about how do we redesign our institution to put our students at the center and better support them towards completion, which of course is the goal, or transfer, or completion of whatever credits they want to earn. It doesn't have to be completion of the credential, but getting students to where they want to be. We are the more formal evaluation partner on the new cohort of schools, so if you talk to me in a couple of years, I'll have some outcomes for you. But right now, our questions really were about how do you pull this off, and how do you make a technology-mediated advising initiative the most efficacious it can be? What do you need to do? And so our findings are particularly timely for those of you in California because that's where you are in your own process. It's how do we take these new tools that are about to be launched and use them in the best way possible so that 2-3 years down the line, our students are having better outcomes. So just quickly so you know where data comes from, this is from all of our phase 1, those 19 iPath schools. They were split about evenly. Actually, the first cohort was about 60% community colleges, 40% two-year colleges. The new cohort's about 50-50. We did a pre-post design. Basically what we did was we went to these schools at the very beginning, kind of like where you are now, and said, tell us how you do advising and student support. We want to know how you do it, the good, the bad, the ugly, and tell us how you think you're going to use these new technology tools that you're purchasing. And then we kind of left them alone. We touched base very quickly about 6 months later, and then we went back about 18 months after the beginning of the project, and we did the same thing. We said, tell us how you do advising and student support. Tell us what worked, what didn't, what was really hard, what strategies did you use. And we were able to do a couple of things. The first was just tell an implementation story of how colleges approach this work. The other thing we were able to do was start to track institutional change. So really track the extent to which colleges redesigned how they did business. Our assumption being if you do that, your student experiences will change, and down the line your student outcomes will change. We have a couple of reports already on our website that go into detail with some of our findings. A final report tracking that transformative effort should be released later this spring, and that will be available on our website whenever it makes its way through editorial. So what did we learn? The first thing, and if you take away nothing else, please take away this slide, is that colleges can approach these tools in one of two ways. One being that it's a technology deployment. The other being that this is a reform. Some places tend to think of an advising technology as the easy button, right? We're going to launch this new tool. It's going to be bigger, it's going to be prettier, it's going to be more user-friendly, and then the magical unicorns are going to come in and make everything better. But we're going to keep doing what we've always done because the tool itself, once it's deployed, is going to be the solution. Some colleges said, the tool is just a tool. We need to reform how we do student support. And they really approached it not as a technology deployment at all, although they had to deploy, and don't mean to give the impression that that part was easier, that IT was irrelevant. They were very, very relevant. But that they really approached this as, we want to reform or redesign what we're doing. You can imagine that that led to two very different experiences and outcomes for the school. We, given what we have seen, and given what we learned about this question of deployment versus reform, have come to understand that at its best, at its ideal, technology-mediated advising, whether you call it the EPI or iPads or anything else, is something that uses technology, but it uses it for a very specific purpose, which is to promote and sustain these long-term, holistic advising relationships that research shows really lead to improved student outcomes. So the technology is used in a way that doesn't just speed up business as usual, doesn't just create efficiencies, but creates efficiencies so that advisors can engage with students in a teaching frame, so that students get regular touch points. You know, we don't do this, let's just register you and move on, which I think, given the constraints, happens a lot, unfortunately. You know, so that the technology is the connector between students and supportive adults or supportive staff members and supportive services. So the technology is that tool. And when that happens, when you start to view your e-advising reform as a reform, not a launch, pretty powerful things happen from the point of view of students and advisors. So we started to also think about, how does this play out, right? Like, how do I know this when I've seen it? And what we came to realize is that you can think of advising, and actually you can think of almost anything at a college, as happening in three interrelated contexts. First, there are the structures. That's just how you set it up, right? So do we have centralized advising? Do we have decentralized advising? Do we assign students to advisors or let them go with drop-in? Just that general organization of student support. The second is the processes, which is really the behaviors, if you think about it. How do we do business? Like, how do we talk to our students? What questions do we ask? How often do we choose to read case notes? Do we make it a habit to do that before or after a session? How do our tutors engage with our faculty, et cetera? It's those people pieces of it. And then finally, you've got the attitudes or the norms. How do we view student support? How do we view students? Do we view students as needing to just navigate on their own? Do we view student support and advising as a registration function because we're understandably really worried about enrollment numbers? Or do we view student support as something that everybody does because it's about completing a degree or transferring? You can identify in the student support space, and frankly you can do this in the teaching and learning space, you can do this in pretty much any space in a college, structures, processes, and attitudes. Our feeling is that they all have to work together to support whatever project it is that you are doing. And we actually learned this in some ways from the K-12 system. I used to teach in K-12, and you can imagine, and I think we've all sort of heard about this or experienced it, a school will engage in some sort of a reform. And they change the structures and they bring in new words, and the teachers kind of slap up some new buzzwords on the wall, but they keep doing what they've always done. And then people are surprised that nothing changed when it comes to student outcomes. And that's because the structures and the processes didn't actually go together. And so what we don't want to have happen is when we launch a new technology tool, that we change sort of the technology architecture, but we don't change how we set up or how we behave or how we think about student support. We want those things to be shifting as well. So in the advising and counseling space, this slide used to have animation, so I'm going to try to draw. Again, the Luddite uses technology. What we see, let's see if I can do this. Okay, here we go, is that unfortunately many of our advisors are basically registration clerks. We see this around the country. It happens by necessity. You've got to get everybody registered. They all show up in the 2 weeks before class, and you're focused on getting them into their classes, which is important. But what we really want is this, right? Ooh, I'm a terrible drawer. We want this. And that's why people go into advising and counseling. If you start launching a technology tool, you can create space to do new structures. Suddenly you can assign students advisors. because now you have a portal where we can say, Jane, your advisor is Beth. And now you know to look for Beth because you have a way to communicate that, which is great as long as Jane and Beth get to know each other. But it's important also that now we can do things like developmental advising and case management, because now Beth has a technology that enables her to, before she meets with Jane, say, oh, I see that Jane registered for these classes. She didn't register for math until she doesn't plan on taking math until her last semester. Then she can talk to Jane about that. Jane, let's talk about math. Are you scared of math? Why aren't you registering for math? You understand the implications of that. She can case manage. She knows now she's got to keep an eye on her, right? Whereas some other students who have a lovely, well planned out course schedule and set of courses over 2 or 3 semesters may not need that. And then what we find is that these attitudes start to change. Student support starts to become an institutional priority. Instructors have a responsibility to flag students, so they start thinking about how do I support students to completion, not just in my class. So in theory, that's what technology can enable us to do. And the question, of course, is, well, how do we get there? I talked before about these structures, processes, and attitudes. When we looked at the data from our case study sites, we broke out the data along these 3 continuum. So you can sort of see structures sort of towards the red side. That's very crude. Our structures and processes and attitudes that support our less than perfect advising, right? Sort of our registration clerk model. The closer you get to green, the closer you are to the ideal. And nobody's going to get to the ideal right away, or maybe even ever, but we're going to try because that's what we do. And you could rank a student or a school, excuse me, on where its structures lie, right? And you could say, oh, you know, they're structured really well, but people actually kind of don't know how to do developmental advising, or whatever the case may be. And so using all of the data that we collected at our 6 case study sites, we were able to measure the extent to which advising was structured and enacted in this sustained, personalized way. And we were able to measure it at the beginning of their technology launch and 18 months afterwards and measure change. These are 2 colleges. They're not their actual names. The blue is the beginning, so that's where they started. And the black is where they ended after about 18 months. And you can see that these 2 institutions had wildly different institutional impacts from launching their tools. What's so interesting is that they all had applied for a grant. So they all wanted to do transformational advising work, but Crescent didn't quite get there. And as a matter of fact, we had 6 colleges in our sample. 3 of them looked a lot like Lakeside, and 3 of them looked like Crescent. We couldn't have planned it better. We had 3 that transformed and 3 that didn't. But you can see that even Lakeside, which was considered one of our leading schools, really wasn't at the beginning of the project able to do best case advising. But by launching their tools, they got a heck of a lot closer. Crescent did not. So the question for us became, we thought this was interesting and useful in and of itself, but what we were really curious about was, well, what was happening at the schools like Lakeside that wasn't happening at the schools like Crescent? Because again, they had all applied for this grant. They all wanted to do the work. So it was interesting that only half of them were able to pull it off. They varied. The schools that pulled it off varied in their size. They were not our biggest or our most sophisticated necessarily. And they also varied in their location in terms of their urbanicity and their student makeup. So it wasn't anything along those lines necessarily. So we wanted to understand what the colleges were doing that was different. And so we started to unpack those differences, which led us to what we're considering these research-based strategies for success, which I hope you'll be able to take home with you. So here are some of the things that we found that our transforming schools, the schools that looked like Lakeside, did. The first thing they did, and this won't surprise you given what I just talked about reform versus deployment, is that the schools that transformed actually didn't fixate on deployment. And so with all due respect to the IT people who were incredibly important, they were in a supporting role of this. This was not considered a technology initiative. It was considered an advising initiative. So you can see that this top school here, this isn't Crescent, it's another one of our schools that didn't transform. Their process for doing the work was very focused on go live. And their kind of working assumption was that if they could just get the technology up and running and get everybody to use it, people would change. And what they found happened was they did get the product up and running. I should note that every institution in the sample did, every institution in the project did. And it was hard, and they did it, which was awesome. But they didn't get to a change of use. The folks just kind of kept doing what they'd always done with a new tool, in part because they were just really mad that the use had been mandated. And they also didn't quite know what to do with the tool once it was up and running. They knew how to use it, but they didn't know how to use it to do anything but what they'd always done. In contrast, if you look down here, this school started with what we call process mapping. They sat down and said, okay, what does it take for a student to go from an application to completion? What are all of the steps? Who are all of the people that they need to meet with? What do they need to do? And they mapped it out. They drew a picture. And then they figured out where the pain points were. And they said, oh, here's where we're losing our students. So they made structural changes. They actually went ahead and moved from a centralized advising model to a place where they put their professional advisors in academic schools and departments. So they had an academic advisor who only did health. They had an academic advisor who only did STEM, who only did CTE, whatever they were. They moved their advisors, and they also went from a drop-in advising model to an assigned advising model. And they started to think about how advisors would do their jobs differently once those structural changes had happened. That was the moment that they went live with their technology, after they had made those changes and had started to have conversations about what you would do with those tools. Now, don't get me wrong, it was not roses. We talked to a lot of cranky advisors during our first visit who were not happy about these changes. But because the changes had been made and the conversations had been started, once they went go live, rather than full-on resistance, end users, the people who had to use the tools, started to adopt it and adapt it and figure out, what can I do with this tool to make my job better and more fun and more interesting. And by the time we went back after 18 months, we heard really positive, even from some of our cranky people, descriptions of what the tool could do and descriptions of how they were advising students differently. And that's not to say that this school didn't pay attention to deploying the tool, because they did. And trust me, they had a lot to say about their challenges with their vendor. But that wasn't their primary focus. They didn't fixate on deployment. They fixated on advising. The second thing they did, and this is very much aligned with what I just described, was you need to create a clear vision. So the top vision, this is what we often hear when you say, what's your vision, is kind of mumbo-jumbo. And nobody's going to deny that vision. It's a lovely vision. We want everybody to be successful. But it doesn't tell anyone what to do once the technology is launched. It doesn't give people guideposts, right? It doesn't say, here's what you need to do differently. In contrast, the bottom quote is really clear. I want you to do this so that I can do that, so that I can help you in this way. We find that when colleges have that clarity of vision, you may still get resistance. People may not like the vision, but at least they're resisting something concrete, and they can adapt it. They can think about it. They can figure out how to make it their own. They know what's expected of them, so they can enact those expectations. That first vision doesn't give any signposts, so people just get this vague sense of like freaking out because they don't know what's expected of them. The second vision gives people something to hold on to and enables them to start to change in the direction you want them to. So that clarity of vision seems critical, in part because it helps the people who have to do the actual changing understand what kinds of changes they're going to need to make in their day-to-day work lives. The other thing that we found, and this was fascinating, and we do have a whole paper on our website about this because it was quite unanticipated, was the role of leadership in these projects. Now typically when we read about leadership, we read about what we call presidential. It's this one, where we talk all about how important presidents are in leading change. And presidents are important. But I have to tell you, we had 2 presidents in our sample who literally have had case studies written about them because they're so beloved and well known. And that wasn't enough to move the change forward. The other thing we hear about is sort of this need for transformation and excellent project leaders. How can we support middle management? And we also have some really great middle-level project leaders. Neither of these were sufficient for the change that we were hoping to see. The only one that mattered, the only type of school that actually transformed was this top one, where they had what we call visionary leadership, where you had a president and the project leader who were both able to shepherd the change, who were aligned in their understanding of what the school was trying to accomplish, and were able to work together. And in fact, in some of our transformative schools, they were kind of stuck until both levels of leadership got on board and were able to work together. Once that visionary leadership happened, then we were able to start seeing the change. So this is fascinating because it's not what the literature would have predicted, but it seems quite critical. The final lesson, that was my final lesson, I take that back. How do we do this? So like I said, people kind of freak out, often particularly with the leadership one, because they're like, well, that's not our leadership style. What do we do? How do I start? How do I create a vision? How do I get my president on board? The good news, particularly around the leadership one, is that colleges change their leadership styles over time. With tools and support, they sort of went from a leadership style that maybe didn't shepherd change to one that did. And there are two other tools that we find particularly useful and that our colleges can use to get this work going, because I can't see your face. It's one of the things I hate about webinars, but I would bet that some of you are feeling like, okay, we've focused on the technology deployment, but this woman's talking all about advising reform. What do I do to figure out how I do that? Well, we have two things. The first is we have a framework. We call it the Readiness for Technology Adoption. This is also on our website, and our website will be on our final slide, I promise. That sort of breaks out this kind of technology-mediated change into 4 areas of readiness. Most schools are not ready in all of them, but you can start to use this to think about, all right, what are we good with and what do we need to work on, right? So a lot of what people focus on, as I noted, is the technology. But what I was really talking about was more this culture bucket, right? Thinking about how is your organization ready for this particular change? How does your organization think about advising and advising reform? How does your organization think about using technology to do things in a new way? So this framework is one way to start thinking about, where are we good and where might we need to put a little bit of our institutional muscle behind as we engage in the work. We also have built off of this, and I don't expect you to read this, I'm just giving it as an illustration, a self-assessment that's built off of the RTA. It's basically a series of different differentiators in each of those 4 buckets and ways to see or self-assess your level of readiness on those indicators. What we have done, and quite a number of schools, particularly in the Achieving the Dream Network, but others as well, have used this tool to do is have cross-functional and cross-hierarchical conversations about their reform. So if you take the tool, you can sit with it and it will say, okay, project readiness looks like this, or yes, we have a clear vision that is articulated and actionable. And if you bring in people from different parts of your college, you can sit down and start having conversations about, I thought our vision for this new reform was X. You're telling me it's Y. We need to have a conversation about, what is the vision and how do we communicate it more clearly. It starts to give you some guideposts about where that work can potentially be focused to move your project forward. The other thing that we have done with institutions and that folks are telling us is quite useful is to go back to this band of transformation, the fact that there are 3 pieces of any reform, the structures, the processes, and the attitudes. And folks have used this framework in a couple of ways. One is to just sit down with a project plan and say, okay, I've thought about structure. Have I baked in any process change into my project plan? And if the answer is no, well then that guides you to thinking about what process changes would you like to have happen. So starting to think about, again, which pieces have you been attentive to and which ones have you inadvertently not thought about, which again, we all do this, right? We all think about certain things and not other things. So this is just a way to flag, all right, we've got a great plan for getting this launched, but we haven't thought about how we're going to get advisors or students to change their behavior. Similarly, colleges have used this to do a self-assessment along the red to green bands. You know, sit down and say, okay, our structures don't really support advising in a holistic way. We're focused on enrollment and registration. What are the things we might want to do to move toward a more holistic approach? Or, you know, our advisors are really good at doing advising as teaching, but, you know, our faculty still don't own student success to completion. So what are we going to do to change those norms? Whatever it may be. But breaking out the functioning of your institution in a way that enables you to think about the different pieces that go into student success, enables those conversations and project planning to focus on the pieces where you may need a little bit more work, and give you the confidence to say, you know what, like our structures are really good. Like we don't need to revise those. We can take our energy away from that and move it towards something else, because we all know we have very limited energy and time. So rather than focus on things that seem relatively functional, let's move to the things we need to work on. So both of these frameworks we have found to be quite useful in project planning, and again, they're available on our website. We can share the slides and you can take them back to your project team or to others in your college to sort of think about how do we engage in the advising piece of this work. I'm also happy to discuss it further with anyone who has questions. And to that end, I will leave the website here and open it up for discussion. I want to leave ample time for questions and concerns. So have at it.
There, Q has posted in the chat window there that if anybody has any questions to post them, and I do see that.
I see that Bonnie does about the models and the counseling and the academic advising. Yeah. So that's a great point. We have done work in California, although there were no California sites in the first cohort that we pulled data from for this project. And I think it's a great point that, you know, we use advising and counseling interchangeably because it's national and every state has their own lexicon. But yes, in California, advising and counseling are different functionalities. One of the things that I think is really interesting is that regardless of whether it's California or another state, launching these tools seems to be launching conversations about the extent to which support functions and roles may need to shift. And certainly in the United States, it's going to be harder to do that, but that doesn't mean it's not a conversation worth having. So we are starting to see places that are doing things like creating career ladders for advisors, for example. The other thing that we're starting to see is that in places where counseling and advising are separate, these tools enable a greater degree of communication between those two roles. So one of the things that I think, and I do a lot of work talking to students, it's really frustrating for students to get bounced from person to person, even if from sort of a structural staff perspective that bouncing makes sense because of role differentiation. From a student's perspective, they just feel like they're getting handed off. And one of the things that's nice about a lot of these tools is that if you can use things like the case management note functionalities, you can start to share information about students across roles. And again, this plays out differently in different states depending on, you know, rules around roles. Certainly there have been really interesting conversations about who needs to know what about students when. But from a student's point of view, if you have to go to an advisor for course registration and go somewhere else for some other piece of the student success puzzle, it's really nice to be able to walk into those meetings and whoever you're meeting with already knows enough about you that you don't need to retell your life story, right? Because now staff are able to start talking across those different roles in a way that's more coherent. And again, this is the place where the technology is the tool that enables that conversation. So to Bonnie's original point, yes, there's a different context in California in some of those roles, but I think that it's important to acknowledge that, but also say that sometimes those roles are a challenge from a student's point of view, and in its best vision, this technology can help overcome some of that. And I apologize for interchanging the tools. That's just the term. That's just a habit from working at the national level.
Does anybody else have a question for Dr. Karp at this time?
So one of the other things I'll say is that when I do this presentation, this is like a lot to take in, particularly because it's a norm shift for you all sometimes to think about, from technology to advising. So I am very happy to engage in follow-up questions via email if people sort of want to think about it, chew on it, and then reach back out to me. I'm more than happy to do so. It is a lot to digest.
And we will also post the presentation on our website. So anybody who wishes to go back and review the presentation and the recording, we will go ahead and put that out on the website as well.
Sure. Okay, and I see Anita has a question about, oh, now people are asking questions. Excellent. So we threatened to hang out. How would this work in a statewide initiative? So one of the things, it's going to work because you have a statewide initiative happening, which is great because you have the same technology for the whole state, which should help on the integration side of things, the IT side of things. One of the things about this is that we're actually, and I think the data are pretty clear, that we're model agnostic. So I don't actually believe that there's one right way to do advising and student support, as long as from a student's point of view, and I tend to be one of those annoying people who always comes back to put the student at the center. I want it to be good for the student more than anything else. If the student is getting sustained holistic advising that's really focused on teaching and long-term learning, not just getting them registered for tomorrow's classes, I'm pretty agnostic about that model, right? Like whether it's case management or some other form of cohort model, I'm kind of agnostic. Some places do it really well with faculty advising, some don't. And so one of the things that's been really interesting nationally is that even in places where entire states are thinking about this work, it looks very different at the institutional level. Because how you do that kind of support is going to vary from institution to institution. The point is that you create this overarching architecture that's supported by technology. And here in California, that will be statewide. You will have the same technology. You will be using Hobson's for your program planning, and Starfish, which is now a Hobson's product for your early alert, which is great, again, from a student's point of view, because if they switch schools, they'll have the same tools at their disposal. So that architecture, the IT architecture will be the same, but how it plays out from college to college may be different. And I think that's important because you want it to resonate with the culture of an individual college. What is happening with the schools that did not transform? I wish I knew. And are they moving? How are they moving forward now? So we are just starting to do some more follow-up work with a subset of grantees. Not all of the round one sites are participating in round two of this research, unfortunately. But I know anecdotally that all three of them are engaged in this in some way. They're trying to push their work forward. Now, my personal feeling, and this is totally not rooted in data, is that there are going to be different needs to do this work depending on the sophistication of an institution, and that in some instances you might need deeper work on change management. And so there's at least one of our non-transforming colleges that is really thinking about change management and leadership. I'm not sure the others are. But none of them have walked away completely. I'm not sure if they've made sort of more gradual progression towards transformation or if they're still stuck. It's actually a great empirical question of how long does this really take? Can we expect big change in a year and a half? I don't know. I'm not sure. But I would like to find out, because I agree, it's a really interesting and great question. And thank you, Pat, for posting our website.
And again, if nobody else has any other questions, we will go ahead and post the recording and Melinda's slides. And we want to thank you, Melinda, for joining us today and presenting the information that you shared. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you. It's a lot of work for us, and we wish that you were able to earlier. But again, thank you.
Anytime. Thanks, all.
Bye-bye.